Welcome everyone to the GW4 Open Research Week. My name is Kate Eric Page, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming you to our final day of this week's celebration. Just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or use the Q&A function. We'll be monitoring that throughout today's session. Just so you know, this presentation is being recorded. But without further ado, I will pass over to today's presenter, Mark. Mark, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Give it a thumbs up if you can hear. Lovely. Fantastic. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and while I do that, I'll do a quick intro. My name is Mark, and I'm a professor of statistics for health at the University of Exeter, and I'm also a UKRN institutional co-lead for reproducibility. So I'm quite interested in aspects of mostly computational reproducibility. And I'm going to be talking today about a pilot that we ran last year now. We only managed to get it written up towards the tail end of last year, so it still feels quite fresh in my mind, even though it did happen almost a year ago now. Okay, so this work has finished, but we are looking to take it on, and I'm very keen. So my plan today is to talk to you for about 30 to 35 minutes. Leave plenty of time for questions and discussion, ideally. So I'd love to hear from other people, from other institutions, about how you think this might work in your institution, or just ideas for improvement. A proper discussion would be really great because I'm really keen to hear from you guys. Okay, next slide. Hang on, let's see. Here we go. Okay, so a bit of motivation, right? Reproducibility, I'm aware everybody here is interested in reproducibility. I'm going to convince you to be even more interested. The basic principle is that if it matters, it's checked. Okay? When you board a plane and you're going on holiday, there's a few safety checks that happen. They want your tray tables in the upright position. They want your seats upright. They want your window blinds up, seat belts on, phones off. Okay. They check some of those things. They don't check all of those things. And notably, they don't check that your phone is off. And there's a very good reason why they don't check that your phone is off. It's because it doesn't matter. There's no evidence that phone signals will interfere with communications in the cockpit, right? It just doesn't exist. The reason they say that to you is because your phone will constantly try to connect to the nearest network when it's up in the sky, and it'll just waste its battery as it's doing that, and it can't connect anyway. But they do check your seatbelt, they check your window, they check your tray table. They check these things because those are properly important safety issues. When you go to the supermarket, there's an expectation that you'll return your trolley, and some supermarkets incentivize that with a coin in there, but nobody's actually checking. And the reason they're not checking is because it doesn't really matter. Yes, it's important. Nice people return their trolleys, but if you don't, the store doesn't grind to a halt. Somebody comes around and does actually check that the trolleys are back. My argument is that post-publication reproducibility is important, and I don't think we check it enough, and we should, because it does matter, and if it matters, it should be checked. I think the signal that we send to the research community when we don't do post-publication reproducibility checks is that it doesn't matter, that it's not important. You've ticked the box on your CV, you've got your publication, and you go on your merry way and you never think about it again. And I think we should be changing that culture a little bit. And this pilot that I'm going to talk to you about is part of that ethos. Okay, so next slide. So this comes from an idea from the Sainsbury lab. It's the 333 system in the Sainsbury lab. In the Sainsbury lab, I think it's Cambridge, and they do things with plants. So here there's some researchers interviewing a plant and taking its blood pressure, that kind of thing. And they take 3 manuscripts randomly selected from the principal investigators in their lab every 3 months, and they choose 3 figures from those 3 manuscripts, and they check those for reproducibility. They check to see if they can get the same figure or table from those outputs. Now, this is all well and good in the context of the Sainsbury Lab. So it's a very good organization, good institute, but it is contained. They have a list of who is in the Sainsbury Lab at any one time. They're working on plants, so they're doing original research. They control the data. It's all very similar kind of stuff. I imagine I might be wrong, but it's all plant related activity. So we wanted to take this notion and expand it out and do something a little bit different. We have some key differences that we have for our pilot. We wanted a wider remit, so not just on plant science. So we have three faculties in the University of Exeter. We asked the faculty leads to choose a department in their faculty to take part in this pilot. We didn't choose them, the faculty leads did it themselves. So it's a wider remit. We have a much broader range of activity going on in these three departments. It's not just all plant science. So the three departments that ended up being chosen were economics from the business school, humanities, arts, and social sciences from from Penryn, which was one of our campuses in Exeter, right down in Cornwall. And then the third one was clinical and biomedical sciences. So three quite different areas. And again, this is a difference from the 333 for the Sainsbury Lab. The other thing that we changed was that we have, as well as a wider remit, we also have this narrower remit. And there's a person in Bristol, Fiona Booth, and she comes from a pharmaceutical background. And one of her key ideas is that you have this approach to checking work that is proportionate to its importance. So if something is really important, you check it a lot. If something is not very important, you check it less. And as outputs become more and more complicated with more and more supplementary appendices, and we're expected to do more and more in response to reviewers, it's probably not the case that the 17th table in Appendix 3 of the supplementary material is as important as the claim made in the title or abstract. And that's the view that we take. And so what we're saying is we are going to check the quantitative findings from abstracts of selected outputs. And that makes our work a little bit easier. And I think it has this proportional element, and I think it's quite a wise approach. It makes everything more efficient and streamlined. We're focusing on published outputs. So, there's a case to be made to do this pre-publication, to make sure that work is reproducible pre-publication. And I think that is valid work. And I think in lots of ways, that's a really good time because you can change things pre-publication. But we've decided to focus on the post-publication check because we think it's also important that after something is published, that it remains reproducible for a reasonable period of time. When I got this idea, this idea came from one of the head honchos in the University of Exeter. He's a medical mycologist, and he was friends with the lead of the Sainsbury Lab. And he brought this idea. There was a little bit of work written up around it, and there was a sort of an element of a punishment about it. There was this idea that if your work was randomly selected, and we checked it, and there was a problem in it. What would happen? What would be the consequences? And there was kind of like a yellow card kind of system. And if you had two strikes, then it was a letter to your head of department kind of idea. And we read that and we just felt we didn't want any of that. We wanted it to be entirely supportive, that this would just be a check. We would write up a report at the end to tell researchers how well they did, which bits they did really well, which bits that they could improve on. And this is against a backdrop in the University of Exeter, where we do have a series of workshops on coding for reproducibility. So there is support. There's workshops aimed at beginners, intermediate, and advanced level for various types of coding for reproducibility. And so we feel like we are in this position where we can just be supportive. And so there's no punishment involved. So as I said, the scheme started off as a 333. We then started talking about it as a spot check for reproducibility, but the term spot check just kind of feels a little bit aggressive, like flashlight in the face kind of idea, connotations of, show us your papers kind of And so we went with a much more anodyne reproducibility evaluation. That's the title. Um, in my head, I still think of it as the spot check, and I think in lots of ways that describes it a little bit better. But I can see that, reproducibility evaluation feels a bit safer for everybody, and so we stuck with that. And I should also just highlight this is a pilot, and so we're checking our processes. We're checking to see how this works. I'm not going to labor the results of this. The numbers are small. I don't think we want to talk too much about those. Okay, next slide. So this idea was a couple of years in the making, and I presented the idea before we did it to lots of parties, and I heard lots of criticism of it. So people, pointing out the flaws in it, the likely problems, the disadvantages, and I think that's natural. Academics, do that kind of thing, and it's completely understandable. What I would like to just highlight, because often we gloss over this, what are the benefits? Why would you do something like this? Why would you check reproducibility of published works after they've been published? And one of the things that I think is really good is that it is light touch. Most people, most researchers under this scheme in a big institution are not going to be selected for a reproducibility evaluation. So we're doing this check to improve things, but it's not onerous for your average typical researcher. We argue that it can be handled completely supportively and there's no element of punishment or anything like that. So it really is a benefit. Researchers do like when you look at their work and they like to know that others are reading what they've published. So this is a formalized way of that happening. I know that in Bristol, they're very keen to use some similar scheme and to go to external funders, pharmaceutical people in particular. They have very high standards in their field, and they want to see that universities are maintaining those high standards. And this can be a badge of rigor. If I mean, I think part of research culture statements, these kind of schemes which check the rigor of an institution's work are important. And the other thing that we're very aware of at Exeter is that when we talk about reproducibility, where does the burden fall? Well, typically it falls on junior researchers who are conscientious. They're the ones who are doing all the extra work to make their research open, to make their research reproducible. And it is a lot of work. It means that you will do less because you're doing it more rigorously and you're spending time curating your code. And so it's always good to have these external incentives that reward people who are doing the right things. And so we're very keen that those benefits are acknowledged. Okay, so the timelines for this basically came about serendipitously. We had this idea, and then I had an email from somebody in my university saying, we've got an underspend in a budget. Can you spend 20 grand by July? And so we were like, yes, we have this idea. So we found out, I think it was the last day of February that I got the email saying there is this budget underspend. And I would say this was last year. So financial climates have changed a lot in the university. So I'm not sure this would happen again. But we got the project funded in February. We spent March planning it. We did a bit of hiring in May, ethical approval in June, which only left June and July to do the actual thing, which is really frustrating. It's always the way, but the time for the actual work is always squeezed at the end. And so I would say I would love to have had more time to plan this and spend a bit more time on our processes. And I'll come back to that in the reflections bit at the very end. Okay. Um, so the team. So on the left-hand side, these are the research fellows who did the actual work. So there's Andrew, Omnia, and Cigar, and they all came from different backgrounds, except for that they were all recent MSc graduates from the University of Exeter with some aspect of data science in their MScs. They all came through slightly different pathways. Andrew was a computer scientist slash mathematician as an undergrad, and then he moved into the data science space. Omnia had a bachelor's in science, and then moved into data science. And Cigar was engineering, electrical engineering, and then a master's in data science. Chris supported from the library side and was massively helpful with identifying the outputs. and coordinating lots of the research. John Luff is a senior research software engineer, and he helped again with the organization. He was a sounding board for checking coding issues and things like that. I'm not sure how much that was required, but it was good to have him in the background. And Eilish and Gavin and I are the co-leads for reproducibility. So together, this was the team that produced the work. I would say it was because we're so very focused on computational reproducibility, it was very important that the three research fellows all knew their way around software. They were all very good coders, and they kept pretty good notes, which is really helpful. So if we were doing this again, I do think that kind of pool of people is important. I spend an afternoon every year on LinkedIn just searching for MSc. I run a conversion course, an MSc conversion course in data science, and I search for people on LinkedIn just to see where people end up basically. And so having that pool of people that I could contact and say there's some casual work going, because that's how we got this done in the end. We didn't have time to employ people formally on contracts. We did casual work, and they claimed for their hours, and it worked reasonably well. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about how much it all cost. Next slide. So these are the numerical results. I'll talk you through it a little bit, but I'm not going to labor it because, like I said, this is a pilot. This is much more about the process than actually the numbers at the end here. So our three departments were economics, HAS, and clinical and biomedical sciences. Those are the three circles at the top. And we selected all outputs published for a calendar year, it was 2023, that were recorded on our, I think it's OR, the system that we use. So these were all the outputs that were affiliated with these departments. And you can see there's various different sizes of departments. So economics had 43 outputs. HAS Penryn is much smaller, and there was only 13, while clinical and biomedical sciences had 116. So we then selected 12 at random from these numbers. So 12 from economics, 12 from HAS, and 12 from CBS. So only one of the HAS papers got excluded. We wanted to have this equal mix from all three departments so that we could have learnings from these different disciplines. So of the 36 articles, about 17, maybe half, had statistical claims. And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean by statistical claims, but I'm basically thinking numbers in the abstract. Do they use some kind of quantitative science and make some quantitative claim in the abstract of the output? You can see the breakdown of the 19 papers without statistical claims in them. And so, those ones we didn't pursue any further. We didn't contact those people. Of those with statistical claims, about half of them had data available, and slightly less than half had code available. And the intersection of those two, which is where we could actually do a reproducibility check, was 4 outputs. So about a quarter of the papers that were eligible for a reproducibility check provided the raw materials to allow an external evaluator, which was us, to conduct a reproducibility check. Now, of those 4 papers, roughly half reproduced, so we had no troubles. When I say no troubles, it's not typically, click a button and you get the same answer, but it was possible to follow the pathway of what they did and reproduce the numbers to our satisfaction. One of those did not reproduce, and I will say a bit more now. That one that reproduced, it did provide code, it did provide data. We did not contact the authors for assistance when we were struggling. And my view is that had we contacted the authors of that paper, they would have been able to tell us and explain to us what happened because it was well laid out. I did trust that it was going to be reproducible, but because we're not experts, right? So this was a paper in economics. We're not experts in economics, and we probably needed a little bit more help for it to be reproducible. And the final one of that 4 was not reproduced before the funding ended. And I think that probably is reflective of how complicated it was. I'm not certain about that one. I don't know whether it would have reproduced with more time or not. But that's basically how you can, I think that's the picture that we see in our university in these three departments. Okay, it's much more interesting to talk about the process stuff, right? So I think we shouldn't, those numbers would probably vary if we did it again. Um, so operationalizing a quantitative claim. Here is a abstract of a qualitative paper. They report on the experiences of 10 recruited patients. Should we be asking for the data files to see that there was 10? 10 is a number, that's a quantitative claim. Is that something that we should be spending time on our reproducibility evaluation? There's a median calculated, a median age of 66 years, a range of years. Our view was that this did not constitute quantitative claims. We felt that those numbers are not critical to the findings of the paper. So our view was that this was not eligible for a reproducibility check. You know, your view may be different, and you may think that that is something that should have been included. But I think really tightening that and making clear, because I think we had a view in our head about what a quantitative claim was, and this for us didn't cut it. But I think we could have been a bit more explicit about that. We then, as well as conducting the reproducibility evaluation, we sent a questionnaire, and that was what the ethics approval was for. We sent a questionnaire to participants asking about their involvement. Now, when we originally envisaged the study, we had in our heads this idea that we could do a graded reproducibility check. We wanted the data and the code to be freely available to any external evaluator. They could do it without contacting the authors. But we knew that that might not always be the case. So we felt we'd like this approach where, could we do it without checking? Could we do it with author assistance? And then if the code or the data was sensitive, could we do a screen share where they run us through their code and analysis, and we just kind of watch what they're doing and check that the number from the software matches the number in the abstract? That was our plan originally. We ran out of time to do that. So I would say we didn't really involve the researchers in the reproducibility evaluation at all. This was a hands-off thing. So most of the people who had this kind of view, they were told that their study had been selected, but after that they had no real involvement until they had some feedback from us at the very end. So yeah, so I think the participation to the researcher, there wasn't a whole lot of use, and some of them never had feedback because most of our papers didn't have quantitative claims. Okay, so a future rollout of the scheme would include more departments than took place in the pilot. Do you think the process would facilitate that? There was very limited burden on researchers, so I think it was probably quite easy for them to take part. This time scale issue came up regularly. Apologies if you can hear noise. I do have builders in at the moment. Hopefully, it's not too distracting. But we have so this time scales did come up regularly, and so they wanted to know they would like a bit more time. They want to be told in advance that the reproducibility evaluation was happening. There was an expression that some people would like to choose which paper. So we chose at random, and they said, well, that was not very good because I don't have access to the data. You should choose this one instead. And it kind of misses the point, I think, of a reproducibility evaluation. You don't get to choose your best work or anything like that. And so I think we would stick with what we have, but just be aware that people do want a little bit more control and try to manage that expectation a little bit better than we did, I think. So do you think it's a good idea? So I'm going to just leave this up here. I'm not going to read from it, but this was really where lots of the interesting results of the pilot came through. The first one here, somebody thinks that reproducibility will be a prominent thing in the future. So they're not really sure that it's really important at the moment, but increasingly so. They liked that it was light touch. I've highlighted the one the response there that this researcher believes this duplicates reproducibility efforts already undertaken by journals. And I would say that is not a universal view. That's not a universal thing across fields. There are computer science journals that do have reproducibility badges that you have to achieve before publication. but I would say that's very much not the norm. So I didn't recognize this message as being representative of research in general. Um, Notions that it doesn't apply to all types of work, and we really do want this to be rolled out across the whole university because it's our view that quantitative work happens in every department. Now, so we are still focusing on computational reproducibility, but it doesn't really matter what department that's in because that happens in all departments. Um, and they felt that there would be differences across different research areas. In general, it was supportive. People thought it wasn't a terrible idea. Nobody really strenuously objected, except for some exceptions. And I think I might have some on the next slide. Yes. So outside of the feedback that we solicited, we did have some people emailing us, and this was an email from a senior researcher whose study was chosen for the pilot. And their view was this was completely inappropriate. The data was small, the analysis is simple statistics, and they don't see any benefit from showing the statistics are correct, which I found a pretty extraordinary viewpoint to have. I looked up this paper. I felt it was absolutely doing computational work. It would have been possible to conduct a reproducibility evaluation on this work, and important in my view. But I put this here just to remind ourselves, because everyone here is at the Open Research Week. We're all converts, right? We all believe in the importance of this stuff. Your colleagues in other departments are not as invested in this as you are in all likelihood because you're here. So just be aware of that. At the University of Exeter, we recently using our Champions Network, we ran a questionnaire poll on views about preprints. And one of the responses we got from one of our departments was, what is a preprint? And so, there are pockets of excellence, and there are pockets that are probably slightly behind reproducibility matters. And I think we should always be aware of that when we are trying to promote this kind of work. Okay, so executive summary. Participants were broadly supportive. The time taken was acceptable because we really didn't involve them. We asked very little of them. But there was mixed views on the usefulness to the researchers. So some were just sort of saying, what is the point if you find that my published work is not reproducible? What am I supposed to do with that? And again, I think that that's a useful thing in itself. I think that feedback is important. At the moment in the UKRN, we're writing a primer on computational reproducibility. And it's very apparent that computational reproducibility is a spectrum. You can go from, click a button and you get the exact answer to completely impenetrable and everything in between. And everybody, I think, is somewhere on that spectrum, and everybody can inch towards, probably that way, towards being good. And I think that is the purpose of this. It's supposed to be supportive. And if the work is not reproducible and you link to a Git repo, for example, you can do something post publication. You can still update that GitHub, and the work will just automatically be reproducible for longer. Okay. And this is an example of the type of feedback that we gave to one of the papers that we conducted this reproducibility evaluation on, and it's quite practical. There was this; it wasn't just this, right? So we gave some supportive comments. We said thank you for taking part. This was really great about your work. But if you wanted to make your work even more reproducible, here are some concrete steps that you could take to make it reproducible to an external person. And I think that this is helpful, right? So this is helpful to a individual researcher. It is tailored to their own work. We have a captive, an interested audience. People love talking about their own work. And so my view is that this is a real benefit if you can do this kind of work at scale. Right. So reflections. So I have so I'm on a half an hour. I've got two more slides, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on these reflections. Number one, senior leadership buy-in is really important. So it became clear to me when we sent out emails to people, they came from John Luff. He's a senior research software engineer. but some of the responses I kind of felt when I got involved softened. So I think that who makes the approach changes the nature of the response that you get. And I do think that the emails coming from someone in a fairly senior position or citing senior leadership buy-in is important. And the higher that you can go, I think the better. I mean, I think it's regrettable that that's the case, but I do think that some senior academics respond better when it's a senior approach, and there we are. Support. So because we did this on a casual claims basis, our researchers did not have full affiliate institutional accounts. That meant they didn't have full software access to things that we pay institutional licenses for. And that's really frustrating because when I was hiring them and setting up them on the casual claims system, it was a click of a button to say, can I have an affiliate account? And I didn't click that button because there was a charge associated with it. And had I realized, I would have clicked that button. So if you were in the same position, making sure that because there was some papers like where there was only one of our researchers had access to Stata, so she had to do the Stata check, whereas it would have been better for all of them to have Stata access. I think having some budget for accessing data is important. So there's a lot of biobank data out there, and if you could pay to get access to the same biobank data, then you can do some more reproducibility checks. We didn't have any budget for that, and so that would be important. Terminology is key. We had some feedback from another researcher saying that reproducibility as a movement was gendered and that open research is more inclusive. And if we could use the term open research, that would be more acceptable to a wider pool of people. I would say I'm not sure that that view is universal, but I do just think that we need to be very clear with our terminology. Reproducibility, replicability, these things have different meanings in different fields, and so you probably just do need to explain what you're talking about every time, define it every single time for every audience. Um, there's work to do. That not everyone thinks this is a good idea, and some of them are mentoring PhD students, and that is the case. So don't think that the fight has been won, that everyone is on board with reproducibility because it's such an obvious good, and that is not the case. We still have to make that argument. Um, we did this in a rush. And when I was writing this up over the tail end of last year, I struggled to find the numbers to populate that flowchart. And I had to go back and redo them. And I did them in a kind of a fairly manual way. And I think that we could have a much better and more reproducible workflow ourselves for this work. It's reproducibility is hard, it's time consuming, and but we should be practicing what we preach, right? So if we're saying that this is important, we should be doing that ourselves as well. The final point I would say is that our consent process was a bit confusing. So we selected papers for reproduction, 36 of them. Whether the authors agreed to being in the study or not, we were going to do that check. So we don't need permission to check the reproducibility of a published work. So our consent process was not about asking people, do you want your work to be included? Our consent was about, can we contact you to ask your views on how the pilot went for you? And there was confusion about that. People thought they could withdraw their paper, whereas we didn't think that they could withdraw their paper. We were going to be doing that check regardless. But I think we should be making that much more explicit in our consent process. So next steps. So let me just double check. Yeah. So I'm there's a few things that I think I would like to do, and I would love to hear views from people on how this might play out in their own organizations. One of the things that we could do is to focus on ref returns. So, ref is a thing that consumes universities. People do spend time on it. There is budget associated with improving ref returns. If we could, finagle our way into that whole realm, then I think there may be some budget to do some of this work. If we're saying this work will improve the ref return, maybe inform a research and environment or culture statement, that kind of activity, I think that could be useful. If we have a list of papers that are, going to be returned to ref, we could check those. And that this framework, this is how this framework works. You need a pool of papers. Maybe it's your best work. Select randomly from that and check the reproducibility. I think that would be really interesting to see how reproducible are ref returns in our organizations. We could include or extend this to pre-submission. It makes the timescales very tricky. You need to be responsive. Authors are not going to hang around waiting for you to do your reproducibility evaluation check if they're about to submit. And so that's important. We'd like to pilot this in more disciplines. So we did this in 3 departments. I'd like more of the humanities departments to be included. And we can start spreading the word more in those areas, and I think that would be a challenge, and we'd probably want to extend the pool of research fellows that we use to conduct those evaluations. Related to that is the second last point. One idea for us is to use this as a secondment opportunity for PhD students and pay for 3 months of their time, get them to pause their studies, and then we might have a big pool of researchers for our PhD students from lots of different disciplines, and they could conduct reproducibility evaluations in their own fields. And I think that's quite a nice learning opportunity for PhD students, an opportunity for them to get a bit more money than on their stipend, probably. And it could be a win-win situation. I think all of this requires more funding. The casual claims bill came to just over £10,000, and we also paid for John Luff's time. I can't remember how much that was. We had a total budget of £22,000 for this pilot, and I think we probably spent 3/4 of it, something like that. But to do this more, I think you would need a bigger budget, and then the efficiencies would come. So we spend a lot of time setting up our processes, and to do another 30 wouldn't be double because we've already set up things a bit. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. I'm very interested to hear questions, criticisms. I'd love to hear from people who would like to do something similar in their own organization. Um, but I'm going to stop sharing now and then return to, hang on, questions. Okay. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat or raise a paw. Um, okay. I think Jason, you were the first on my screen.
Hello, I'm Jason Harper, Head of Library Research Services at the University of Bath. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. Really found that very interesting. I just wondered whether you felt the researchers should be involved in the reproducibility analysis. Just curious to know whether that would add to the rigor, or actually should it be that their research can stand on its own 2 feet and withstand, analysis without them having to explain it.
Our view at the start was that we would include them, that we would go down this graded approach, but we didn't have time for that. I think all things are important. I think having the reproducibility check, the first step should be, can we do this without any assistance? And I think that's if you can get a handle on that, then that's interesting. But I think it's legitimate to contact authors. The one paper that we found that was not reproduced, when we sent that back, they were a little bit horrified. They had made their code available, they'd made their data available, they had done a lot of work so that somebody could do the check. And so I did feel bad when I had entered a correspondence with them, and I did feel like had we contacted them and included them, that their work would have been reproducible. Um, I think it should, in the best case scenario, you wouldn't need to do that, but we're all human, and I think it's better than lots of the papers where you couldn't even do the check. So Uh,
Did your audio cut out? Um,
it might have
oh
done.
no, no.
Yeah.
Hi Mark. Yeah, really nice talk. I'm gonna bang on about carrot and stick again. So I guess yeah, a lot of this stuff is very carrot focused, and yeah, a lot of the backlash you get is very familiar to me as a evidence synthesis when we ask for data from old papers and we get emails from professors who are personally affronted by the request. Um, I mean, I think, this is just philosophies of change, but I do think that we need a bit more stick sometimes, and because I understand the fear of a lot of people is that a lot of this stuff, especially when you bombard them with information, is really intimidating, and it's skills which they haven't learned. They've learned other skills throughout their career, and that's how they've made their name. And even when you present like ways of like all these workshops we're running, it's still intimidating. But the only way to, I think, get them on board is to something like ref or like have, yeah, at least they can then hire people. They will be motivated to hire people who can do this stuff, I think. And but I don't know, your thoughts on carrot and stick and
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
hello.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is that even though we did our best to remove all of the punitive language, it was palpably clear when we contacted people that they felt that we were carrying a stick. So,
Yeah.
in some sense, even though we did our utmost to remove it, it didn't really
But is
matter.
it because you're carrying the stick though, and it's not ref? If ref was carrying the stick, or funders were saying we require this, then money talks, right?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there's a lot to be said for that. And that sort of, I mean, that's the way the culture will shift overnight, right? I mean, if that happened, then that would change things.
Yeah, and I think this carrot phase needs to happen to get to there. It's just when we kind of, yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
know, and I know the UKRN are doing a lot of that stuff in the background as well. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't be averse to that. I think that there's a role for the funders in improving reproducibility. Whether that is, appropriate for this kind of scheme, and to be honest with you, the reason why we wanted to remove the punitive stuff, we don't want to get involved in that, right? I don't want to be sending emails and having a go at people for doing things that I think are not as good as they could be. I'm not interested in particularly in that. Um, what I think is interesting is that we removed all of that punitive stuff, and people still thought that it was possible to happen. So I think you kind of get the benefit of the stick without even having to implement it, because a lot of these researchers are overachievers that thought that somebody might email their head of department, even though that was never what we were going to do. Just the in their own heads that that threat might happen. I think will potentially will.
yeah. Sorry, no, sorry, I'm banging on. I'll shut up.
I'm just going to let my cat out. He's yowling. I'm listening. So
Yeah,
Daniel,
when I say stick, I don't necessarily mean punitive. I do mean just like equivalent rewards for like to a paper or winning a grant for this stuff. Yeah.
I mean, so that I mean that's definitely carrot, right? I mean that is reward rather than stick.
Yeah, I guess, but then, there's like an implication that if you don't do that stuff, then you know,
Yeah, yeah,
your
okay,
career's in jeopardy if you don't get enough paper, right? So, yeah.
okay, yeah. Um, Daniel, you go. I'm gonna let the cat out while I'm listening.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Mark, that was really, really interesting. Thanks a lot. I suppose I was going to ask something else, but I think I'll riff off Matt a tiny bit and say that most of these things are going to be driven by money, right? So all of this stuff is difficult, and as you just said, you probably wouldn't get the money that you got last year, this year. Um, and it really is. I think because most funders are now saying you need to do open data and open code, especially UKRI and welcome and stuff like this. And I would still be intrigued to know what our I imagine they don't collect data on compliance to those things, and that's because it would take quite a lot of time to do that. I mean, I have a UKRI grant and they do not check up that much on research fish about what I do, for example. Um, so I think it's going to have to be that top down for what it is. And my main point was that it, what I would take from that is I would love for you to do for one of my papers to get flagged because that would be quite nice. But what do you do with the 3/4 of papers that you have to chuck in the bin because they don't share their data and their code, which is worse than the people who are sharing but not reproducible?
I mean, I think that's a very good point. There are lots of reasons why people can't share their data. And some of them are legitimate, some of them are not. Um, and I think experts will disagree over the middle group. And so, it won't always be clear cut that somebody should definitely have shared their data. Code,
Did
I think, is a bit.
Sorry, did you have a flow chart within that you couldn't even try? Did you evaluate what their availability statement was to say this is a good reason or this was a bad reason, or was that out of the scope?
We didn't do it. I think it's fully within the scope. I think it's a very good idea. We could go back and double check whether we think it was legitimate to not make the data available. But I don't have those numbers to hand. My impression was that I was surprised with the clinical and biomedical sciences how few had data available. Mostly it was because they were citing biobank data, and they kind of said, that data is available, but we can't make it available because it's paid for kind of service, which I think it is legitimate, but I would have liked to have been able to get that data to do the check. So yeah, so I think we should have a look at that and see where the reasons are and whether they're legitimate or not. And your main point, I think it is important also that we would go back and contact those authors who did not make their data or code available and just say, we weren't able to reproduce this because your data and code wasn't available. And I think that feedback was good. We only gave detailed feedback to those where we could actually conduct a reproducibility evaluation. For the next one, I would want to do that. Sorry, Amy, there's one or two comments in the chat which I might address first. Is that okay? So the comment from Joe. Oh, hang on. What are the implications when the reproducibility check can be carried out for those only who is there a carrot needed to get people to publish code? Yes. So that's the point that Daniel is making as well. Yeah, that's a very good point. And I did feel like when I was writing the feedback to the one paper that didn't reproduce, I did say this paper was better than most. We were able to conduct a check on this paper, and most we weren't able to do even that. And most of the eligible ones we weren't able to do that. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. And so Nick, so paper analysis aren't reproducible without full data and code availability. Why not pre-select only papers that do that to get to the first round of selected papers? The selection of 36 didn't include that and wasted time. Yes, I mean, I think automating that process though is not totally straightforward, I would say. So identifying which of the 36 have included the right data and all of the right data and the right code and all of the right code is something that you only get to when you have a look at the paper, I think. You probably would be able to do an exclusion of those that just don't give any code at all. But I mean, I think that's what we did. So we didn't further explore those 19 papers that were not appropriate for the reproducibility evaluation. Lots of stuff about pointy carrots. And then Jason, funders should ask for and check evidence. A good open research practice. Point we heard yesterday from Joe Jenkinson is that they don't have the resourcing to monitor this. That means they're unlikely to check reproducibility. And making reproducibility checking costs claimable within the grant, I think, is an interesting idea. Yeah, I think more funding for this kind of activity is good. Okay, Amy.
Hi, thanks, Mark. That was very interesting. I'm based in Exeter, and I've been working on a project trying to reproduce some simulation models, so it all feels very close to home, which is really interesting. I'm definitely more on the side of incentivizing, and I just wanted to flag an interesting example, but you might already be aware of it, in the University of Sussex in the School of Psychology, where they offer an independent service where people can request a computational like reproducibility assessment before publication or kind of at the preprint stage, and that all gets published on OSF. But yeah, I can see you're already aware of it, but just to flag it as a really cool example of a way of doing this in a kind of with a different angle on it, I guess.
It's a really cool example. So Rennie runs that, and I had a meeting with her just before this, actually. She's part of the computational reproducibility group, and it is interesting. And chatting to her about the stories she has of the papers that get submitted, there was one example of a paper that got submitted for this reproducibility check. It's a voluntary check, and she found some fairly clear evidence of research misconduct, in my view. So extraordinary kind of situation where I think it was somebody volunteered it, and then there was potentially misconduct from another author on the paper. So the person who volunteered it didn't realize. But yeah, really interesting stuff. And I think I do like the idea of incentivizing. So Amy, you work a bit with Tom Monks, is that right?
Yep.
So Tom has been doing and Amy have been working together on this reproducibility checks of a specific field, and I've seen the work that they produce, and it's fully reproducible. So it is way better than the workflow that we have, and that the plan is to try to work with those guys for the next stage, if and when we get funding to do it. Okay. So let me just see. No other hands. Valerie, and please see examples of supportive action from publishers like this. Okay. Yeah. And there's an article about checks from Amy, UKRN. Oh yeah. 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 Fab. Okay. Right. Any other? Oh, and they get up. Yes. Yeah. We did contact Amy Rennie for her reproducibility check, and she checks the whole thing. So she goes through the whole paper and checks every bit of it, the published work. And so we took a small subset of her workflow, of her checks, because we were just focusing on the abstract, but we did base it off of what she was doing. Matt.
I'll go on then. Yeah, I was just wondering what's your definition of reproducibility, and because sometimes I think when you said about like people can't use, you have to have someone who uses SPSS. What I've done with like meta-analysis and stuff is like, read the SPS files into R, and then, I only want to approximately reproduce the result, and I think that can help a lot with some of the barriers, but I don't know how stringent you are.
I would say we could be a lot more explicit about what we classify as reproducibility. We looked at numbers in abstracts. Numbers in abstracts don't tend to get reported to 7 decimal places. So we were looking at the number in the abstract. Can we get that number? And that was our definition of reproducibility.
So it's not like a significant effect or not significant effect.
We would view that as a claim, yeah, as a quantitative claim. So if somebody said
even if the coefficient is different, or
yes.
Yeah, okay.
So sometimes the abstract would refer to a quantitative claim made in the body of the text. But if the quantitative claim, like this was a significant finding, was made in the abstract, we would double check that against the body of the text. That was the only time we kind of went into the manuscript itself. In helping write the primer on computational reproducibility, it's becoming clearer and clearer to me that computational reproducibility is a massive spectrum. Nothing is reproducible in the long term. You wait long enough and everything stops being reproducible. So you have to specify a time frame. Should work be reproducible by a random person that I grab off the street who's never seen a computer before? Is that what we're talking about? Or should you be a climate scientist to be able to reproduce climate science work? And in the middle there's a big spectrum of opinion, I think, that is valid. With what resource? So how long should it take you? So, if I give you the raw forms in a box, then maybe my work is really good and you could reproduce it, but it would take you a lot of time. And you know that's in my view, that's not reproducible. But there's a spectrum. If your code is slightly messy, then it is possible to reproduce, but it's not easy. And we should have a specification of what time commitment, what resource commitment is reasonable to conduct that check. And there's a whole range of things that I think, is it the fourth appendix? To what decimal place? What are we talking about when we talk about computational reproducibility? And I don't think that it's fully straightforward. But I do like the idea of scrutinizing important claims more. And from my view, I'm not interested in bitwise reproducibility, which some are. I am interested in third decimal place reproducibility. If it changes the scientific claim, that's what I care about. If it doesn't, I care less. But it's not always, you can't always predict that in advance. Sometimes the fifth decimal place does change things, particularly if that number goes into further calculations, and it can change things quite a bit. Okay, so we're approaching the end of the hour. I can see aligning science across Parkinson's, do this to an extent with AI developed with data seer. Okay, interesting. I will have a look at that. We're doing some work with data seer through the UKRN on how you do metrics for open research. So how you automatically identify whether something is pre-registered, whether it's fair data. There's about 6 pilots going on that topic. Oh yes. And so those are reporting. The extended deadline was the end of last month, so we're all still just a little bit beyond that deadline, but it's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, I think. So how long did it take to complete a single reproducibility check? Do you have a sense of how much this would increase for studies involve sensitive data, given the timelines for requesting access can be pretty long? Would these sorts of checks be feasible in those scenarios? I mean, my view is that this should be a rolling program, that it shouldn't be time limited. So if you had somebody doing these checks, then if it took a bit of time to get access to sensitive data, it wouldn't matter, because you'd go on to a different project, a different study, and check that one while you're waiting for the data access request. So if it was a rolling thing like that, I think some of these issues are iron out. We had 2 months and 3 research fellows. They basically claimed as if they were doing full weeks works, so 8 weeks for each of them. So they were trying to write it up at the same time and getting to grips with what we were doing. We double coded things, so we got 2 of the research fellows to look at each paper so that we could look at we could have agreement between them. And so yeah, it was time consuming, but I would say that it was time consuming because it was the first time we did it, and to do this at scale would be much more efficient in my view. If we went down the route of PhD students on secondment, though, we'd have this constant conveyor belt of training of those PhD students, and we might lose some of that efficiency, but you'd gain in other ways. So yeah, when I presented this to another person in the UKRN, his initial reaction was when he heard that the final figure, he just thought completely unfeasible at scale. So 20 grand, and we checked 36 papers. He felt that was a bit rich, and I could agree with that. But I think if you were doing it regularly, you'd probably have, you'd probably be able to do 4 times as many papers, if not more, for the same time. Okay, we're about a minute to the end. Thank you very much, everybody, for the attention. If anybody wants to contact about this, I'm very happy to chat about it offline. And if anyone is interested in doing something similar at their organization, this is not an Exeter idea. You would tailor this to your own setting, but I'd love to chat with you if you are interested. Okay, thanks very much, everybody.